It was time, really. The reason all of us in the Beatles shied away from Beatles material directly after the breakup.
Welcome to the show, Sir Paul McCartney. Do you get standing ovations wherever you go? Do you like Starbucks? You walk into a Starbucks, everything.
Starbucks.
That's it. I just finish my latte later.
Musically, I just knew it was a tragedy. I got a younger brother.
The Rolling Stones. Paul McCartney names the 5 rock bands he hates most. In the long-standing debate between Beatles and Stones fans, Sir Paul McCartney's private stance has often been more biting than his public comments suggest. While interviews over the years have portrayed a mutual respect, insiders now reveal that McCartney viewed the Rolling Stones as, quote, a blues cover band that got lucky. This sentiment, first whispered during a late-night Abbey Road session in 1968, resurfaced decades later when Paul, in a 2021 interview with The New Yorker, doubled down on his view, suggesting the Beatles cast a wider creative net. Former Apple Records executive Peter Brown disclosed that McCartney often saw the Stones as trailing in their footsteps, releasing copycat album concepts months after the Beatles had already broken new ground. Tensions reportedly flared when John Lennon considered producing a Stones album, prompting Paul to question why Lennon would lend his genius to what he considered an inferior act. Though McCartney has occasionally praised specific songs, he consistently positions the Beatles as the innovators and the Stones as the imitators, famously quipping during a Rolling Stone interview, "They're a great band, but they're just not the Beatles, are they?" For McCartney, the rivalry was never just friendly competition. It was a defense of legacy, the Sex Pistols. It's no secret that punk rock rattled the foundations of the music industry, but few were as publicly rattled, albeit privately, as Paul McCartney. When the Sex Pistols burst onto the scene in the mid-1970s with raw, chaotic energy, they weren't just rejecting the establishment, they were gunning straight for it. And at the center of that establishment, whether he liked it or not, stood Paul McCartney. According to John Eastman, brother-in-law to McCartney, Paul was visibly upset by the Pistols' rise, calling their sound an assault on the ears. The disdain was mutual. Johnny Rotten labeled McCartney a dinosaur, and rumors swirled of Pistols members using Beatles posters for target practice. A tense encounter at London's AIR studios in 1977 would be the final straw. McCartney attempted a civil introduction, only to be dismissed by Sid Vicious as a sellout. Paul reportedly walked away without a word and never acknowledged them again. Though he later conceded that punk cleared the air in music, he never warmed to the Pistols. His 2016 BBC comment, "Not my cup of tea," was laced with a frosty undertone, proving that time may heal most wounds, but not when the insult cuts as deeply as a shot at one's musical legacy. Oasis. During the heyday of Britpop in the 1990s, Oasis stormed the charts with swagger and an unapologetic obsession with the Beatles. While fans celebrated their melodic similarities, Paul McCartney reportedly saw their admiration as lazy mimicry. According to longtime publicist Jeff Baker, McCartney found Oasis's style insultingly derivative, accusing them of reducing the Beatles' groundbreaking legacy to recycled chords and borrowed melodies. Behind closed doors, he labeled the Gallagher brothers as arrogant upstarts, particularly after Noel Gallagher's now infamous claim that Oasis was bigger than the Beatles. The comment reportedly infuriated McCartney, who considered such bravado both absurd and disrespectful. Even a seemingly cordial moment at the 2000 Q Awards revealed underlying tension. When Liam Gallagher asked for an autograph, McCartney's body language was described as stiff and distant. Despite publicly acknowledging Oasis's role in keeping guitar music alive, Paul never fully endorsed them. In a 2018 GQ interview, he summed up his view with a single line: "Good songs. Wish they'd found their own voice." It was a polite jab from a man whose own voice helped redefine modern music, and who never appreciated having it copied so blatantly. The Monkees. In the eyes of the world, the Monkees were a light-hearted, Beatles-inspired television band that produced a string of catchy hits. But to Paul McCartney, they represented something far more offensive. A corporate caricature of the very thing he and his bandmates fought to build. Beatles assistant Alistair Taylor recounted how McCartney would instantly change the radio station if a Monkees song came on. Paul reportedly took deep offense to their manufactured origins, stating during a 1967 argument with manager Brian Epstein that they were 4 actors pretending to be a band, and that their existence was, in his view, a mockery. McCartney grew even more agitated when the Monkees began incorporating psychedelic elements after Sgt. Pepper's release, accusing them of copying the Beatles' sound and aesthetic without doing any of the creative labor. According to George Harrison, Paul would seethe over their success, calling it blueprint theft, a now infamous snub at a 1968 party where McCartney reportedly walked away mid-conversation with Monkees member Mickey Dolenz, sealed his stance. Even decades later, Paul's diplomatic comments, such as "catchy tunes, but they were certainly no Beatles," barely masked his enduring contempt for what he saw as a band built on imitation and marketing rather than music and merit. The Bee Gees. Though the Bee Gees are now celebrated as one of the most successful acts of the 20th century, Paul McCartney's feelings toward the Gibb brothers have always been lukewarm at best and bitter at worst. Their explosion onto the global stage with Saturday Night Fever came at a time when McCartney's post-Wings career was experiencing a dip, and according to producer Chris Thomas, the timing didn't sit well. Paul, once revered as the pinnacle of pop songwriting, now found himself outshone on the charts by a trio he viewed as opportunists. Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber recalled that Paul would scoff at their falsettos, accusing the group of selling out their early Beatles-like sound in favor of disco flash. The two acts even crossed paths in the same Miami recording studio in 1979, but McCartney reportedly shifted his schedule to avoid encounters. Tony Bongiovi, the studio manager, observed that Paul became tense anytime someone praised the Bee Gees' commercial success. While he never publicly attacked them, the omission of their names from any of McCartney's tributes to great songwriters speaks volumes. Even after the death of Maurice Gibb, McCartney's condolence statement was described by insiders as short and mechanical, a stark contrast to the heartfelt tributes he paid to peers he respected. The Beach Boys. Arguably, Paul McCartney's most complex and intense rivalry was with the Beach Boys, particularly their mastermind Brian Wilson. What began as mutual admiration quickly spiraled into a cerebral battle of musical one-upmanship. According to Beatles producer George Martin, McCartney became obsessed after hearing Pet Sounds in 1966. He played the album repeatedly, dissecting every layer, then immediately demanded the Beatles push further, directly influencing the creation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But admiration turned into veiled hostility when Wilson struggled to complete his magnum opus Smile, which McCartney reportedly dismissed as the work of someone who couldn't finish what he started. The tension boiled over during a now infamous 1967 dinner at Brian Wilson's home, where Paul criticized the Beach Boys' harmonies as predictable, leaving Brian devastated. Over time, McCartney downplayed the influence the Beach Boys had on the Beatles, telling interviewers their harmonies were lovely but overrated. Even when praising God Only Knows, a song he once called perfect, Paul often added qualifiers, such as for American pop or for its time, subtly diminishing their impact. Music historian David Leaf once noted, "Paul respects Brian, but he'll never admit how much he was pushed creatively by him." For McCartney, To fully acknowledge Wilson's influence would be to concede that the Beatles were not always the ones leading the charge. Led Zeppelin. Though not always cited among McCartney's most obvious musical rivals, Led Zeppelin occupies a peculiar space in his catalog of quiet criticisms. While the band's hard rock dominance captivated millions, Paul reportedly remained unimpressed. Insiders suggest that McCartney viewed Zeppelin's bombastic style as lacking in nuance and songwriting sophistication. According to former road manager Tony Bramwell, Paul was once overheard saying, "They're all volume and no soul." The contrast in philosophy was stark. While Zeppelin favored heavy riffs and explosive performances, McCartney cherished melody, harmony, and structured compositions. A chance encounter in the mid-70s backstage reportedly ended on a frosty note, with McCartney declining to discuss collaboration or creative ideas, allegedly muttering, "Not really my speed." The divide was less about personal animosity and more about an ideological chasm. Paul simply didn't believe Zeppelin contributed meaningfully to the evolution of music in the way the Beatles did. During a roundtable interview in the early 2000s, when asked about Zeppelin's place in rock history, McCartney responded with a non-committal, "They had their moment," signaling his belief that their impact, while loud, was ultimately short-lived in the grand narrative of innovation. Nirvana and grunge. Paul McCartney's relationship with the 1990s grunge movement, and Nirvana in particular, was marked by detachment rather than overt dislike. But those close to him say the disconnection ran deep. Nirvana, led by Kurt Cobain, ushered in a new era of anti-establishment sound and ethos that challenged everything bands like the Beatles had stood for. Clean production, harmonies, and structured songwriting. McCartney, though never directly insulting the band, often avoided commenting on their influence. A rare 1994 backstage comment reportedly had Paul saying, "I don't get the appeal. Angst and distortion isn't a song." Music insiders reveal that he viewed grunge as a nihilistic detour from musical artistry. Ironically, McCartney would go on to collaborate with surviving Nirvana members years later in a high-profile performance, but sources say he was never fully comfortable with the arrangement. "It was like two worlds colliding," said one production assistant. Paul brought order, and they brought chaos. Despite the commercial and cultural significance of Nirvana, McCartney's legacy-centric mindset kept him from embracing a genre that questioned the very foundations he helped build. To him, grunge was a cultural moment, not a musical movement. Radiohead. As critics often placed Radiohead among the most innovative bands of the late 20th century, McCartney maintained a suspicious silence. Unlike his well-known praises for acts like David Bowie or Prince, Paul rarely commented on Radiohead's influence or artistry. That silence, according to former EMI executive Nigel Sinclair, wasn't incidental. Paul found their music overly cerebral, Sinclair stated. He once joked that it sounded like homework set to a synthesizer. While Radiohead fans lauded OK Computer and Kid A as generational masterpieces, McCartney was reportedly unimpressed, privately calling their music cold and self-important. The generational divide was clear. While Thom Yorke's abstract lyrics and experimental sounds fascinated modern audiences, Paul remained grounded in melody, lyricism, and accessibility. A music journalist who once interviewed McCartney in the early 2000s recalled asking his opinion on Radiohead, only to receive a curt, "I prefer songs you can hum." While he never launched a public criticism, McCartney's silence spoke volumes, drawing a clear line between what he considered innovation and what he deemed alienation masquerading as art. U2. Though the public relationship between Paul McCartney and U2's Bono has often appeared amicable, sources within the industry reveal an underlying friction that has simmered for decades. Both men are titans in their own right, but while Bono's activism and public persona have earned global admiration, Paul has occasionally rolled his eyes behind closed doors. According to former charity event organizer Julia Penn, Paul once remarked, "I write songs, not speeches," after being asked to co-headline an event with U2. He admired their showmanship but criticized what he saw as performative grandstanding, particularly when it came to Bono's habit of mixing music with moral crusades. Musically, McCartney reportedly found U2's sound repetitive and formulaic. It's like they discovered echo pedals and never looked back, he was once overheard saying in studio banter. The two icons have collaborated on charitable causes, but sources suggest that Paul keeps a respectful distance, preferring not to be lumped into the same savior of the world archetype. Even in recent interviews, McCartney praises U2 with guarded wording, describing them as a very big band, noticeably stopping short of calling them truly great.